An apparent love triangle turns violent when betrayal and taunts spark a brutal attack. After discovering her boyfriend's affair with a younger woman, a pregnant mother's turmoil exploded into a savage attack with, of all things, a claw hammer. But the shocking story doesn't stop there, because each of the key players has a tangled legal past. From reckless driving sprees to a ruined military career over cannabis, the twists keep on coming, and we're going to break it all down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We have quite a wild one for you today. It starts in a pub in Hull. It's a port city in East Yorkshire, England, in April of last year. And this is where a mother's fury erupted in just a shocking and brutal attack. 31-year-old Kirsty Allen had allegedly just discovered that her boyfriend, 29-year-old Lennox Green, had been cheating on her. And the woman at the center of the alleged affair was reportedly 22-year-old Georgia Caldeira, nearly 10 years younger than Allen. But according to exclusive reporting from the Daily Mail, it wasn't just this apparent betrayal that pushed Allen to the edge. No, it was also the alleged cruel taunts from Caldeira herself that set the stage for this very violent confrontation. So let me unpack this case for you from the beginning. According to the Daily Mail, Allen, who was apparently pregnant with Green's child, was reeling from the discovery of his affair with Caldeira. But then things escalated when she received a Facebook message from Caldeira that we can't repeat verbatim, but essentially taunted, said, "I slept with your boyfriend." That message apparently pushed Allen into a blind rage. A friend of hers later told the Daily Mail that it wasn't just the affair, it was the message combined with the betrayal that apparently sent her over the edge. A UK outlet, Hull Live, reports that the prosecutor said Caldeira had gone to the pub with her cousin and had her back to the door when she was reportedly blindsided by a sudden attack. The Daily Mail cites that without warning, Allen swung a claw hammer directly into Caldeira's face. And aside from the shock of the attack, think about the pain there. Caldeira was apparently reeling as blood reportedly poured from her face. I mean, if you've ever used a claw hammer for any work around the house, you know how dangerous that can be, having someone swing it at your face. But the chaos didn't end there, because in this frenzy, Allen apparently lost control of the hammer, accidentally injured herself with the claw end. And this, as she reportedly shouted, "I'll do you in, I will kill you." Both women were left bleeding in the aftermath of this. People screamed in a panic, rushing to help. Bystanders scrambled to separate the two women, call emergency services. Staff at the pub quickly rushed to Caldeira's aid, applying first aid to stop the bleeding. But despite their efforts, the damage was already done. Hull Live reports that Caldeira had a depressed fracture to her cheekbone, a 1-centimeter cut, and some swelling. The attack ended up leaving a permanent scar on Caldeira's face. Now, thankfully, she was rushed to the hospital immediately after this incident. But again, thinking about this, it honestly could have been so much worse, a claw hammer. Now, meanwhile, Miss Allen didn't even try to leave the scene. She was apparently escorted out of the pub by other patrons, arrested shortly afterward. According to the Daily Mail, in the aftermath, Allen admitted to everything. She confessed to assaulting Caldeira, causing bodily harm, using the hammer as a weapon. She also admitted to a fray, which in the UK involves using or threatening violence in a public place, causing a disturbance. During the trial, Allen explained that she felt completely betrayed by Green and that Caldeira's taunts only fueled her anger. Meanwhile, Caldeira told the court that she had no idea why Allen would target her. Allen's lawyer, Kaye Hodgetts, confirmed that the assault stemmed from emotional distress, said that Allen was genuinely remorseful for her actions. But the Daily Mail and Hull Live also reported that she was not a first-time offender. As a matter of fact, she reportedly had convictions for a whopping 11 previous offenses between 2008 and 2010, including assault when she was a minor. Allen had apparently been out on bail while the trial was going on, but the court sentenced her to 18 months in jail. Yeah, just a really wild, disturbing case here. To help me break down this, again, crazy, wild case, what we're hearing so far, and there's more I want to talk about, I want to bring on special guest, criminal defense attorney, friend of the show, former prosecutor in the Domestic Violence Division, Anthony Osso. Anthony, thanks so much for coming back here on Sidebar. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
I'm just going to ask, initial thoughts on a case like this? You heard me lay it all out.
Wild. Anytime that there's a hammer involved, and it's a bludgeoning case, that's just a completely gruesome set of facts. And to your earlier point, the pain that Caldeira must have felt when that claw end of the hammer struck her is just unimaginable. So pretty wild.
Could have ended in death.
Absolutely.
That's the key
Yeah.
here. By the way, if this had happened in the United States, could this have been charged as attempted murder?
Sure. Attempted murder or aggravated assault. Oftentimes, those two offenses carry the same punishment range, and they'll file it as an assault. But the hammer is certainly an aggravating element because it's a deadly weapon.
Mm-hmm. And in cases like Miss Allen's, where you see this perceived emotional distress, this apparent betrayal plays a significant role. I just covered a case the other day where I talk about there's several motives for why people do what they do. It could be money, it could be jealousy, it could be love. How do you think a defense attorney would approach arguing that the defendant's actions here were impulsive, they were driven by emotion, there was emotional distress? How would that look in a defense case?
Well, I would lean in really hard into the infidelity and the fact that not only was Green unfaithful to her with this woman at the time that she committed the offense, but that she was pregnant while that happened. And then even more icing on top, and what you don't oftentimes see, is that the person that Green was sleeping with was actually taunting Miss Allen. And so she was receiving things that could promote that kind of emotional response from two angles.
And does that mean it would downgrade a charge, or does that mean somebody could be acquitted?
That's a good question. It really depends on the jurisdiction. Typically, when you're talking about sort of heat of passion arguments, that will just downgrade the charge. And that's where a person does commit a certain offense, but they acted out of passion that rose from adequate cause, right? As opposed to insanity or temporary insanity, where you actually don't recognize the consequences of your actions. Here, we're looking at more likely a reduction in sentence as opposed to an acquittal of charges.
The thing that I think complicates this case is if you have a defendant who has an apparent previous criminal history, how does that affect the case? How does that affect sentencing, particularly in cases, again, involving violent crimes? If you have previous convictions of assault as a minor, is that an aggravating factor in terms of sentencing? How does it affect the actual prosecution of the case?
Absolutely, it will affect the defendant in sentencing. It really drives a wedge in the suddenness or the fit of rage that the defendant was allegedly or perceived to have been acting under. That being said, I think that some of the prior criminal history of Miss Allen in this case was pretty attenuated. I think it was over 10 years ago. So there's a chance that that kind of evidence might not come in. But in the event that it did, and a judge or jury found that out, it definitely goes against any argument that this was sudden passion or out of emotion alone.
In the U.S., if she were to take the stand, the defendant, and testify, would her previous convictions automatically come in? Would she be questioned about them?
More likely, most likely not. Under the federal rules of evidence, which most states apply during trial, prior criminal convictions from over 10 years ago typically aren't let into trial. That being said, if the defendant takes the stand and says something like, "I've never been in trouble," or "I've never done anything violent before," then at that point, they've opened the door, and the prosecution would likely be able to cross-examine on prior violent criminal acts from a while back.
By the way, there was another strange detail I mentioned before where I said that Caldeira, it was reported when she took the stand, she said, "I don't know why I would have been a target." I felt an interesting statement to make if that reporting is true.
I would agree, Jesse. I think her testifying in that manner, and then if a judge or jury saw what text messages she was sending Allen before the attack took place, I don't know that they'd necessarily argue that she's not a good person, but they might bring to light that she is not the most, remorseful type of person or someone to feel sorry for. And that resonates with juries. I think that they don't agree typically with infidelity. And so the taunting on Miss Caldeira's part probably wouldn't benefit well for the prosecutors.
Does that sentence make sense to you? 18 months?
It depends on what the entire punishment range is. I think had she previously been to jail or prison, I think it's a little bit on the light side. I think there's an obvious intent to kill, but then again, there's a lot of mitigating evidence here. She was pregnant at the time. I would say it seems light, but again, I haven't opened the entire file.
That's fair. That's fair. I wanted to ask you about this. So she was charged reportedly with affray, so using violence in a public space. Is there a similar charge that could be applied in the United States? What would that equivalent charge be? What would penalties for it look like?
Similar to rioting, I haven't really dealt with charges of affray in public. So I can't really speak to the exact parallel of that charge in the United States.
And by the way, the bystanders, right? This happened in a public place. Witnesses were there. Are they legally liable? Didn't jump in immediately to stop the assault, assuming assuming they didn't just see it unfold in real time and there's nothing more they could do. But generally speaking, if you're seeing an attack, and I can't tell you how many times, and I'm not saying this happened here, but it just made me think about how many times I see people videotaping a fight and not stepping in. Is there any legal liability for when there's an attack happening in a public place and nobody does anything?
No, and I really think that the defense you would see in that instance is you're not expected to put yourself in harm's way. And it's different than a person in distress. But when there's a criminal attack going on, the unfortunate reality is I don't think that there are repercussions against the public. And it's frustrating, right? You go on YouTube and you see these videos of people filming people being pulverized, and it's an all too common response. So interesting question, because I don't think there's a repercussion, but maybe there should be.
Yeah. Now here it seems, based on the reporting, people did jump in. They tried to separate them. They tried to render first aid to Miss Caldeira. I do want to say this. This is interesting. So the story really doesn't end there, because as shocking as this attack was, it's only one twist in a much larger drama. Georgia Caldeira, the victim, has her own tangled legal history. So according to reporting from Hull Live, she served jail time due to a dangerous and reckless driving spree. But get this, the outlet reported that she was actually given a chance by the judge to avoid jail time if she stayed out of trouble, but seems like she just couldn't do it. I'll start with the first incident, which happened back in May of 2023. Hull Live reports that Caldeira was caught driving dangerously, failing to stop for police, driving with no insurance or license. And because of that incident, she was given a 10-month prison sentence, but the judge suspended it for 2 years, giving her a chance, to turn her life around. And Hull Live reported that she was also required to complete 150 hours of unpaid work, 20 days of rehabilitation. She was banned from driving for 18 months. And despite what could be argued to be a gracious decision from the judge, Caldeira seems she didn't end up learning her lesson. Why? Because according to Hull Live, on November 17th, 2023, she found herself in even more trouble. That afternoon, police spotted a vehicle that they believed had been involved in a recent shop thefts, so they tried to pull the driver over. Caldeira, who was apparently driving, refused to stop. Instead, she sped off, ignoring the police car behind her, attempting to flee the scene. And what followed was a dangerous and high-speed chase that lasted for several minutes. Caldeira raced through the streets of North Lincolnshire, driving at speeds of up to 90 miles per hour. She drove through villages, swerved around corners, even tossed objects out of the car window in an attempt to block the police vehicle. This is again according to Hull Live. And finally, her apparent reckless driving ended when she lost control of the van and crashed into a tree. Caldeira then reportedly tried to run off into a nearby field, apparently kicking off her shoes in the process, but she was quickly arrested by the police. And when Caldeira appeared in court, she admitted that she made a huge mistake. And while her lawyer tried to argue that she could still be rehabilitated, the judge not so convinced. And as a result, Caldeira was sentenced to 11 months in prison, 10 months for her original dangerous driving and 1 additional month for the new offenses. Anthony, another interesting component of this is not to victim shame her, because obviously she suffered just an immense attack. She's been, it seems, permanently disfigured because of this. But I just thought that was interesting to think about her previous criminal history and whether or not that is a factor in this story at all.
It could be. And I know that victim shaming isn't always the route to go, but bringing to light that the victim in any case is unsympathetic is an important and useful tactic from the defense. So I think it cuts against the prosecution's case. And in the end of the day, she didn't deserve to get whacked in the head with a hammer, but she was sleeping with a man who had a girlfriend or wife that was pregnant at the time. So again, a lot of unsympathetic behavior on Miss Caldeira's part, which would be relevant in a trial.
By the way, in the United States, what are the factors that judges consider when they're deciding whether to suspend a prison sentence? How common is it for a defendant to maybe fail to meet the conditions of that suspended sentence?
At the outset, when a judge is deciding whether to give probation as opposed to prison, they're looking at things like prior criminal history, behavior during the pendency of the case, the nature of the crime itself. And then after the fact, when they've already been put on probation and they violate, judges are typically a lot more strict. They're going to look at what the violation was for. If it's for a technical violation or failure to pay a fee, they might not revoke. But if it's for a new law violation, such as we have here, oftentimes you will see judges revoking defendants' probation and sentencing them into custody.
And it seems the judge initially gave Caldeira this second chance, right? A second chance to avoid prison time, just stay out of trouble. She seemed to fail that. When U.S. judges are exercising discretion when trying to give a defendant a second chance, especially in cases involving repeat offenses, how does that work?
Well, from a defense perspective, you really have to look at what the root cause of the problem is, and is it something that the court can address without sentencing the person to prison? But if it's routine violent behavior or just a defiance of the law, then it's a lot harder for the judge to say, okay, well, what can we do to get this person to abide by the laws of our nation? So it depends on the circumstances, and it's very case specific.
The hope, I guess, is that they're rehabilitated, that they deserve a second chance, but it gets complicated. Sure. And I'll tell you what, you might think that's the end of the story. There is a little bit more that we want to talk about. So Lennox Green, the man at the center of this love triangle, this chaotic drama, he has his own legal mess to contend with. So once a promising Royal Marine, Green apparently destroyed his military career over cannabis plants. 57 of them, to be exact. According to Hull Live, Green had undergone the rigorous training to become a Royal Marine, but his involvement in producing cannabis and the military's strict zero-tolerance drug policy, that's what appears to have led to his downfall, because it all began on September 15th, 2020, when police had responded to a report of a disturbance at an apartment complex in Hull. So they arrived at the apartment of a man named Darren Rook, discovered cannabis plants growing in multiple rooms. One room reportedly had 24 plants, the other had 33, all being cultivated with the help of fans, lighting, a dehumidifier. And as police further investigated, they heard a noise in the stairwell. And that is when Hull Live reports they found another man, David Sanderson, who had a key fob that opened Rook's flat. Now, Sanderson claimed that he was just checking on his friend's place. Police were kind of skeptical, and after searching his home, they found amphetamines, cannabis, and equipment for growing cannabis. Now, Sanderson's fingerprints were found on items in Rook's flat, and his phone revealed text messages and photos of cannabis plants. How does it go back to Green? Well, Green's involvement was uncovered through similar evidence. His fingerprints were found on a dehumidifier, and text messages linked him to the operation. So while Rook wasn't directly forensically linked to the crime, it was clear that he had been paid for letting his flat be used for the growing operation. The total cannabis haul weighed about 7 pounds with a street value of about $39,000 in U.S. money. Now, Green's involvement in that operation led to his dishonorable discharge from the Royal Marines, ending his career. His defense lawyer, Richard Butters, described his actions as a complete lunatic move, considering everything he had sacrificed to get into the Marines. According to Hull Live, Green and Sanderson were given 1-year suspended sentences. Green was also ordered to complete 80 hours of unpaid work and 10 days of rehabilitation, while Sanderson received 20 days of rehab. Rook was sentenced to 50 hours of unpaid work, but despite these penalties, Green's once promising military career has been destroyed by a series of bad choices, it seems. So Anthony, again, now the third player in this, has his own interesting legal developments. Thoughts on this? How would a criminal conviction, particularly for drug-related offenses like cannabis cultivation, that seems like that would impact somebody's career in the military career here in the U.S. as well?
I think so. I think that when you're talking about armed forces, you need, especially at the Marine level, people that are straight-laced and can abide by rule and order. It sounds like a lousy spinoff of the TV show The Gentleman a little bit, and I certainly wouldn't call him a criminal mastermind. I think, to your point, if you engage in an illegal drug operation, that probably should result in your removal from any form of armed forces, especially while you're serving still. So
you mentioned we were talking about rehabilitation in the other cases involving the women. What are the typical rehabilitation programs or community service operations or options available to individuals who are convicted of drug offenses in the United States, especially, those involving cultivation or distribution or part of this kind of operation?
You have varying types of programs. It depends on what state you're in, what jurisdiction you're in, and a lot of it's funding based, but it can vary from inpatient treatment to intensive outpatient treatment to weekly Drug Addicts Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous type of classes. A lot of times if you see that they're put on probation, so they're sentenced, but their sentence is suspended, they will couple treatment with community supervision and things like that. So you'll also see conditions that the offenders are required to seek and maintain employment. So it's all directed at getting them back into becoming a productive member of society.
By the way, got to say this, apparently the text messages, the forensic evidence, you see this a lot. This is some of the most crucial evidence tying people into, crimes, operations that they would, maybe drug operations. I find that so interesting that it wasn't that his presence was there, but it was all this other data that actually linked him to this operation. I find that fascinating. I think in today's day and age, that evidence is some of the most crucial.
Absolutely. And I think jurors expect it. But what's interesting to me is that they use the fingerprints on the dehumidifier. When you're talking about drug trafficking and manufacturing cases, it's typically informant-based and witness-based evidence. So for them to have a physical piece or sort of scientific piece of evidence is a unique and interesting fact that they used in that prosecution.
One thing we didn't look up, and I was just thinking about it, is, the child in all of this, right? You have a very different characters in this. It's a sad story. What typically happens with a child whose parents are, both either convicted or have certain kind of criminal records? Again, I can't speak intelligently on this because we didn't look up what happened to the child or whether the child is with Mr. Green. But if you have parents that are both in and out of the criminal justice system, what happens there?
Well, the first step you'll see is CPS involvement. And the threshold, just because you're convicted or put on some sort of supervised for release, doesn't automatically make you unfit for a parent. That threshold's pretty high. But in the event that it does, or oftentimes we have co-defendants that are husband and wife and they both get sentenced. So we'll try to stagger sentences so that they can parent while the other is serving their time and vice versa. But ultimately, I think the court system would look to place the child with another guardian. And if that's not possible, then it could result in foster home.
Really sad case. A lot of different angles to this. Anthony Osso, thanks so much for running with the punches with me on this. I know I hit it with a lot of different angles, so thank you so much. Always appreciate your perspective.
Thanks, Jesse.
All right, everybody, what a case. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.